England, 1817. The evening light filtered through the grand windows of Blackwood Manor, casting long shadows across the Duke of Hawthorne's study as Lady Eleanor Blackwood stood rigid before her father. The imposing figure of the Duke, his face flushed with anger, slammed his fist upon the mahogany desk with such force that the crystal inkwell jumped and splashed droplets across important papers. "You will marry Prince Stephen of Verbania or be disowned," he thundered, his voice echoing off the book-lined walls, adorned with generations of Blackwood ancestors who seemed to stare down at Eleanor with the same disapproving glare. Eleanor, at 22 years, with chestnut hair cascading in perfect ringlets and defiant green eyes that betrayed her otherwise composed demeanor, trembled slightly, but held her ground on the Persian carpet. "Father, I have never even met the man," she protested, her voice softer but no less determined than his. The Duke rose from his chair, his tall frame made more imposing by the dying light behind him, and circled the desk to stand before his daughter. When he spoke again, his voice had transformed to ice, explaining in methodical detail how the Blackwood fortune had been depleted through failed investments and mounting debts, how their very survival as a family of consequence hung by a thread, and how this alliance with the wealthy Principality of Verbania was their only salvation. "Prince Stephen arrives tomorrow," he informed her, adjusting his waistcoat with practiced precision. "The wedding will take place in a fortnight, and you will do your duty as a Blackwood has always done." Eleanor felt the walls of the study closing in around her as her father turned away, effectively dismissing her from his presence. She executed a perfect curtsy, just as she had been taught since childhood, and walked with measured steps to the door, her silk skirts whispering against the carpet. Only when the heavy oak door closed behind her did she permit her composure to falter, pressing a trembling hand to her lips to stifle the sound of her quickened breathing. A fortnight. 14 days until she would be bound forever to a stranger, shipped off to a foreign land, all to save the family that would sell her like prized livestock. As she ascended the grand staircase toward her chambers, Eleanor maintained the perfect posture and serene expression expected of the daughter of a duke, even as her heart raced with panic, and her mind scrambled desperately for an escape that did not exist. The following morning arrived with a brightness that belied Eleanor's inner turmoil as she sat perched on the edge of a gilt chair in the grand parlor, her back painfully straight and hands folded demurely in her lap. The pale blue silk of her carefully chosen gown cascaded around her like water, embroidered with delicate silver thread that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. The servants had been bustling since dawn, polishing every surface until the entire room gleamed, arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases and stoking the fire to ward off the spring chill. Eleanor had barely touched her breakfast, her stomach knotted with dread as she awaited the arrival of the man who would soon claim ownership of her life. When Prince Stephen finally entered the room, announced by the butler with exaggerated ceremony, Eleanor rose and curtsied precisely as protocol demanded. The prince cut an undeniably handsome figure, tall and lean with golden hair and aristocratic features that spoke of generations of careful breeding, yet when their eyes met, Eleanor felt an involuntary shudder travel down her spine. His eyes, a pale grey, assessed her with the clinical detachment of a man appraising horseflesh at auction, his smile practiced but never reaching those cold depths. Their conversation as they sat opposite one another was excruciating in its formality, each word measured and proper while conveying nothing of substance or warmth. When the prince took her gloved hand in his equally gloved one, the contact felt like ice seeping through the fabric. "I understand your father's estates are quite extensive," he remarked in accented English, his gaze traveling around the room before returning to her face with renewed calculation. "I look forward to adding them to my holdings." The casual possessiveness of his tone made Eleanor feel like merely another asset being transferred in this arrangement, her value measured in acres and tenants rather than as a person. She smiled and responded with appropriate platitudes, each word tasting like ash in her mouth. Later, as she passed by her father's study to retreat to her chambers, voices drifted through the partially open door. The prince was speaking, his tone businesslike and detached. She will need considerable refinement before presenting her at court, but the alliance is satisfactory. Her father's rumbling agreement sealed her fate like a tomb being closed. Eleanor continued to her room, maintaining her dignified pace until safely behind closed doors, where she pressed her forehead against the cool window glass. Gazing out at the freedom of the estate grounds that had once been her sanctuary and would soon be beyond her reach forever. Unable to sleep that night, Eleanor tossed restlessly among her silk sheets until the confinement of her bedchamber became unbearable. The moonlight streaming through her window beckoned like a silent invitation to escape, if only temporarily. Wrapping a woolen shawl around her nightgown and slipping soft leather slippers onto her feet, she navigated the darkened corridors of Blackwood Manor with the practiced stealth of someone who had spent a lifetime learning every creaking floorboard. The night air embraced her as she slipped through the servants' entrance, cool and sweet with the fragrance of early spring blossoms, filling her lungs with the first deep breath she had taken since meeting her betrothed. The extensive gardens of the estate spread before her, silver tipped in the moonlight, offering temporary sanctuary from the prison her life had become. Eleanor wandered without purpose, trailing her fingers along the damp hedgerows, past the formal rose garden, with its precisely pruned specimens still dormant from winter, toward the boundary where the manicured grounds gave way to more practical areas of the estate. It was then she noticed a thin column of smoke rising against the star-studded sky, unexpected at this late hour, when even the servants had long since retired. Curious, she followed the path that wound toward the source, a modest stone cottage set apart from the main estate buildings, its purpose given away by the anvil and rough work table visible outside. The blacksmith's cottage, Eleanor realized, remembering vaguely that her father had mentioned hiring a new smith after old Mr. Winters had finally succumbed to age. As she drew closer, the rhythmic sound of hammer striking metal carried through the darkness, a steady heartbeat in the quiet night. Warm golden light spilled from the open doorway, casting long shadows across the worn path. Something about that steady rhythm pulled Eleanor forward until she stood at the edge of the light, momentarily transfixed by the scene before her. A man stood with his back to the door, his powerful frame silhouetted against the red-orange glow of the forge. His sleeves were rolled up to expose forearms corded with muscle, his movements displaying both tremendous strength and surprising precision as he shaped the glowing metal beneath his hammer. Thomas Clark, the new blacksmith, worked with complete absorption, unaware of her presence as he focused entirely on his craft, his profile sharp against the forge light, beads of sweat glistening on his brow despite the cool night air. Eleanor found herself unable to move, captivated by the raw authenticity of the scene so utterly removed from the artificial politeness that governed her world. Thomas paused mid-swing as a slight movement at the door caught his eye, the hammer halting in its arc before gently lowering to rest on the anvil. Turning toward the entrance, he was startled to find a young woman standing at the threshold, her delicate nightgown and shawl a stark contrast to the rough surroundings of his workshop. Even in the uneven light of the forge, he recognized her immediately as Lady Eleanor Blackwood, the Duke's daughter, whose presence at his humble workshop at this hour was as unexpected as a snow flurry in August. "Your Grace, is something amiss?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature, rough hands quickly wiping on a nearby cloth as he made a slight bow. Conscious of the impropriety of the situation, yet concerned by her appearance so far from the main house at midnight, Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless, struck by his direct gaze, warm brown eyes that regarded her with simple human concern rather than the calculating assessment she had endured all day from her betrothed. There was no artifice in his expression, no careful measuring of her worth or station, just genuine attention that made her feel suddenly, strangely visible. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty to this virtual stranger when she had spent the day offering nothing but practiced pleasantries to her future husband. "The sound of your hammer was comforting," she added softly, feeling foolish even as the words left her mouth. Yet Thomas nodded as if her midnight wanderings made perfect sense, offering her a rough-hewn stool pulled safely back from the heat of the forge. They spoke briefly, their conversation flowing with unexpected ease across the vast divide of their stations. Eleanor discovered he had recently returned from fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, serving as a cavalry farrier before bringing his skills back to civilian life. He spoke without embellishment or pretense, describing the battlefields of Europe with the same straightforward clarity he now applied to his craft. The metal remembers its true nature, no matter how we try to force it, he explained, gesturing to the piece cooling on the anvil. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from allowing it to find its own shape rather than imposing one upon it. As he spoke, Eleanor felt a peculiar sense of recognition, as if his words about the metal spoke directly to her own constrained existence. His calm presence and complete lack of pretension created a moment of authentic connection that contrasted sharply with the hollow interactions of her day. When the manor clock chimed the half-hour, Eleanor reluctantly rose to return before her absence was discovered, carrying with her the strange warmth of having been, for a brief moment, truly seen. The next several days passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations that felt more like a prison sentence gradually closing around Eleanor. Blackwood Manor, once her sanctuary, had been invaded by the prince's extensive entourage, transforming familiar spaces into foreign territory as seamstresses, diplomats, and additional servants rushed about in constant motion. The grand ballroom had been commandeered as a staging area for the ceremony, the drawing rooms filled with exotic gifts arriving daily from Verbania, and even the gardens were being sculpted to accommodate the royal tastes with no regard for Eleanor's carefully tended flower beds. Morning until night, decisions were made without consulting her, each one another brick in the wall of her future cage. During a fitting for her wedding gown, Eleanor stood empty-eyed on a pedestal in the center of her chambers, arms extended like a doll as three seamstresses fussed with the heavy ivory silk and endless rows of pearls. Her mother, the Duchess, circled critically, discussing details with the head seamstress as though Eleanor were merely a mannequin rather than a person. The prince prefers diamonds for the bodice, the Duchess instructed, examining fabric swatches with practiced discernment. They reflect his family's wealth and will glitter magnificently in the cathedral. Eleanor, finding her voice in this small matter at least, whispered softly, "But I have always loved sapphires." Her mother continued the conversation without pause, effectively pretending not to hear the soft objection, discussing instead the appropriate length of train required for a ceremony of this magnitude. That afternoon, with the manor in chaotic preparation for yet another formal dinner to honor some dignitary from the prince's homeland, Eleanor seized a rare moment of inattention from her lady's maid and slipped away, telling the butler she needed air in the garden. Instead of turning toward the manicured lawns, however, her feet carried her swiftly along the now familiar path to the blacksmith's cottage. She had prepared a plausible excuse about commissioning decorative elements for the wedding feast, but in truth, she was desperately seeking a few moments of respite from the suffocating atmosphere of the manor, a brief taste of the authentic human connection she had discovered on her midnight wandering. As the simple stone cottage came into view, smoke rising steadily from its chimney, Eleanor felt herself draw the first easy breath she had taken in days. At the blacksmith's cottage, Eleanor stood at a respectful distance from the intense heat of the forge, watching in quiet fascination as Thomas worked a piece of glowing metal with methodical precision. His movements were a dance of controlled power, each strike of the hammer deliberate and exact, transforming the formless metal into something of purpose and beauty. "What brings you here, Lady Eleanor?" he asked, without interrupting his rhythm at the anvil or looking up from his work, though the slight curve of his lips suggested he was not displeased by her presence. "Freedom, if only for an hour," she replied with unexpected candor, the honesty of her words surprising herself as much as him. Thomas looked up then, meeting her eyes with a warm understanding that required no further explanation. A simple smile, acknowledging the weight of her confession without judgment or pity. They talked as he continued his work, the conversation flowing naturally between them despite the vast gulf of their stations. Thomas told her of his travels with the army, describing distant lands and cultures with vivid detail that transported Eleanor far beyond the confining walls of Blackwood Manor. He spoke of Spanish mountains bathed in golden light, Italian villages clinging to coastal cliffs, and the stark beauty of Russian winters, painting pictures with words as skillfully as he shaped metal with his hands. In turn, Eleanor shared her love of botany and art, passions her father had long dismissed as frivolous distractions, unbefitting a duke's daughter, but which Thomas received with genuine interest, asking questions about her favorite flowers and the properties of various plants that revealed his own practical knowledge of herbal remedies learned during wartime. The hour passed too quickly, and when the distant chiming of the manor clock reluctantly called Eleanor back to her duties, Thomas set aside his tools and approached the cooling rack where several finished pieces rested. Selecting a small object, he presented it to her with a slight bow, a perfectly crafted metal rose with delicate petals and a slender stem. The craftsmanship so fine it seemed impossible it could emerge from such rough conditions. "Steel outlasts real flowers," he said softly as she accepted the token, still warm from the forge. "Like true freedom outlasts gilded cages." Eleanor clutched the rose in her gloved palm, their fingers brushing momentarily during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through her body that had nothing to do with the heat of the metal, and everything to do with the first genuine connection she had felt in years. A formal ball to celebrate the engagement transformed Blackwood Manor into a glittering spectacle of wealth and power, with local nobility and foreign dignitaries filling the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers blazed with hundreds of candles, reflecting in gilded mirrors and illuminating exotic flowers imported at great expense from distant conservatories. A full orchestra played from the musicians' gallery as liveried servants circulated with champagne and delicacies on silver trays. Eleanor moved through the evening like a ghost in her silver gown, the fabric shimmering like moonlight with each step, diamonds at her throat and wrists catching the light in brilliant flashes that drew admiring glances from every corner. She accepted congratulations with practiced smiles that never reached her eyes, offering perfect curtsies and rehearsed responses that satisfied protocol while revealing nothing of her inner turmoil. Prince Stefan remained at her side only when absolutely required by etiquette, treating her with polite indifference before inevitably drifting toward groups of men engaged in political discussions, leaving Eleanor to the scrutiny of the ladies who assessed her worth with calculating eyes. During a rare moment alone on the terrace, having excused herself with claims of needing fresh air, Eleanor reached into her hidden pocket and felt the smooth contours of the metal rose Thomas had gifted her. The cool touch of the steel against her fingertips grounded her in reality, amid the fantasy world of the ball, reminding her that somewhere beyond these walls existed genuine human connection untainted by politics or advantage. Drawing strength from this small token, she composed herself to return to her performance. As she re-entered the ballroom, the crowd parting respectfully before the future princess, Eleanor noticed additional servants had arrived carrying trays of wine to replenish the dwindling supply. Among them stood Thomas, looking strangely formal in the simple black attire required of male servants, his strong hands seeming out of place supporting a delicate tray of crystal glasses. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room as he bowed respectfully like any servant would to the lady of the house, yet in that fleeting glance passed a current of recognition and understanding impossible to articulate but undeniably real, a single moment of genuine connection amid the artificial pageantry that sustained Eleanor through the remainder of the endless evening. Following the ball, Eleanor retreated to the library seeking solitude among the leather-bound volumes that had been her childhood refuge. The festivities had left her drained, her cheeks aching from forced smiles, and her mind weary from maintaining perfect composure under constant scrutiny. She stood before the tall windows, gazing at the moonlit gardens and absently touching the hidden pocket where Thomas's metal rose rested against her hip, when the heavy door closed with an ominous click. Prince Stefan stood in the entrance, his formal attire still immaculate despite the late hour, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight as he regarded her with cool assessment. "I understand you visited the blacksmith's cottage alone," he said, his voice dangerously soft as he moved toward her with measured steps. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, her hand instinctively moving away from the hidden pocket as though to protect her secret. The prince continued his approach until he stood uncomfortably close, the scent of expensive cologne and wine on his breath as he spoke with precision. "Such behavior will not be tolerated once we are married," he informed her, no hint of anger in his tone, which somehow made the statement more frightening than if he had shouted, "You will represent my kingdom with absolute propriety." His fingers suddenly gripped her arm above the elbow, the pressure deliberately increasing until Eleanor had to bite her lip to prevent a gasp of pain. "I do not require your affection," he continued, his grip unrelenting as he studied her face for any sign of defiance, "merely your obedience and heirs." The cold calculation in his eyes as he spoke of children chilled Eleanor more deeply than his painful grip, making clear that her body was simply another possession he would control. When he finally released her and departed with a formal bow that mocked the violence of his touch, Eleanor remained frozen by the window, rubbing her arm where bruises would surely form by morning, realizing with horror the lifetime of control awaiting her. It was not merely her freedom at stake, but her very safety, trapped with a man who viewed her as property to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. Later that night, returning to her chambers exhausted and shaken, Eleanor discovered a strange woman unpacking clothing in her dressing room. With sinking heart, she recognized her faithful lady's maid of 5 years had been replaced with a stern-faced woman who introduced herself in heavily accented English as having been sent by His Highness to assist with proper Verbanian court protocols. The message was unmistakable. She was now being watched, her final vestige of privacy stripped away as efficiently as the prince had stripped away her illusions about their future together. With only days before the wedding, the atmosphere at Blackwood Manor had grown suffocatingly tense, with final preparations reaching a fevered pitch, and the prince's watchful servants monitoring Eleanor's every movement. Yet fortune provided an unexpected opportunity when the prince's mother arrived unannounced during a dress fitting, sending the household into chaos as rooms were hastily prepared and protocols rearranged. In the confusion, Eleanor managed to slip away, her heart pounding as she hurried along the now familiar path to the blacksmith's cottage, constantly glancing over her shoulder for any sign of pursuit. Thomas was working at his bench when she burst through the door, but one look at her flushed face and wild eyes had him immediately setting aside his tools and crossing to her side. "What has happened?" he asked with genuine concern, offering her the rough-hewn stool as he noted her trembling hands and the unmistakable fear in her expression. The words tumbled from Eleanor in a desperate rush, weeks of mounting dread finally finding release as she confided her fears about the prince's controlling nature, the bruises still fading on her arm, and her father's unyielding position that the marriage must proceed regardless of her growing terror. Thomas listened without interruption, his warm brown eyes steady on hers, offering silent strength until her torrent of words finally subsided into shaky breaths. Their conversation deepened as the afternoon light filtered through the cottage windows, casting golden patterns across the worn floorboards. To her surprise, Thomas revealed his own past. Born to minor nobility in northern England, but renounced his title after the war, unable to return to a life of pretense and empty social obligations after witnessing true suffering on the battlefields of Europe. "We make our own cages, Your Grace," he said softly, stoking the forge fire as he spoke, each of us constructing bars from expectations, fear, and the desperate need for approval, and we alone can find the courage to open them. As they talked, Eleanor became acutely aware of the physical presence of the man before her, the strength in his hands that could shape unyielding metal yet gentle enough to create something as delicate as her steel rose. The firelight played across the planes of his face, highlighting cheekbones that spoke of noble ancestry despite his common occupation, and she found herself drawing closer, as though pulled by some invisible force. When Thomas reached out to steady her as she rose to leave, their hands met in a brief, forbidden touch that sent currents of awareness through Eleanor, unlike anything she had experienced before. Though just the simple contact of skin against skin, it felt more profoundly intimate than any formal interaction she had ever known, a connection of equals that transcended the artificial boundaries of class and station. Eleanor returns to find the manor in complete chaos, with servants rushing through corridors and raised voices echoing from the main hall. The moment she slipped through the side entrance, hoping to return unnoticed, a footman spotted her and immediately announced her presence with undisguised relief. She was escorted forcefully to the grand drawing room where the prince's mother, a formidable woman draped in velvet and adorned with the Verbanian royal jewels, sat rigidly beside her father. "Where have you been?" the Duke demanded the instant she crossed the threshold, his face purple with rage, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth as he advanced toward her with hands clenched into fists. The prince's pale eyes watched the scene with clinical detachment, betraying neither anger nor concern but something far more dangerous: calculation. Eleanor stood her ground despite her hammering heart, her chin lifted in a show of dignity that infuriated her father further as she smoothed her rumpled dress with trembling hands. When pressed again about her whereabouts, she remained resolutely silent, unwilling to subject Thomas to her father's wrath or the prince's dangerous attention. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Prince Stefan stepped forward with the fluid grace of a predator, his voice measured and reasonable as he addressed not Eleanor but her father. "In Verbania," he explained with cold precision, his accent more pronounced than usual, "noble daughters are accompanied by guards at all times. It is a tradition that ensures both their safety and the family's honor." His words hung in the air like a perfectly aimed arrow, striking directly at her father's deepest concern, the family's reputation and standing. The Duke nodded grimly, his decision immediate and uncompromising. Until the wedding, Eleanor would be confined to the house under constant supervision, her every movement monitored by servants loyal to either her father or her future husband. The Duke's pronouncement felt like the slamming of a cell door, but it was the look of quiet triumph in the prince's eyes that truly chilled Eleanor to her core, the satisfaction of a man who had found the perfect pretext to impose his will. That night, locked in her chambers with a guard posted outside her door and the new lady's maid sleeping on a pallet across the threshold, Eleanor stood at the window gazing at the distant pinprick of light from the blacksmith's forge. The reality of her situation pressed down upon her with suffocating clarity. She faced not just a loveless marriage, but a life of imprisonment, first by her father and then by her husband. Each day, a continuation of the confinement she now endured, with even the small freedoms she had taken for granted stripped away one by one until nothing remained of the person she had once been. The eve of the wedding arrives, bringing with it a punishing storm that seems to echo Eleanor's inner turmoil. Rain lashes against her bedroom window in violent sheets, driven by howling winds that bend the ancient oaks of the estate and transform the manicured gardens into sodden marshland. Eleanor stands motionless at the glass, her reflection ghost-like against the darkness beyond, watching lightning illuminate the grounds in brief, blinding flashes. Her wedding gown hangs on a mannequin in the corner, a spectre of white satin and pearls that seems to mock her with its empty promise of joy. On her vanity sits the metal rose, its perfectly formed petals catching the candlelight, a small token representing the freedom and authenticity she is about to lose forever. She takes it in her palm, feeling its substantial weight, so unlike the fragile, real flowers that had always surrounded her life of privilege. Tomorrow she will become Princess of Verbania, her gilded cage complete. The thought sends a wave of physical revulsion through her so powerful that she grips the windowsill to remain standing. In that moment of desperate clarity, Eleanor knows with absolute certainty that she cannot go through with this marriage. The realization brings not panic, but an unexpected calm, as though naming her fear has somehow diminished its power. She watches her maid sleeping on the pallet across the threshold, the key to her room secured at the woman's waist. Beyond the door, a guard dozes in a chair, his occasional snores audible through the thick oak. Eleanor examines the metal rose in her hand with new purpose, noting its strong stem and slightly pointed tip. With silent determination, she kneels before the door and works the metal into the lock, remembering with grim amusement how she once watched a stable boy pick a lock to retrieve a toy dropped through floorboards. The mechanism resists at first, but Eleanor persists with a patience born of desperation, until finally a soft click rewards her efforts. She freezes, listening intently for any change in the guard's breathing, then slowly eases the door open just enough to confirm he remains asleep, chin resting on his chest. With nothing but the clothes on her back and a small pouch of jewelry sewn into her nightgown's hem, prepared days earlier in a moment of foresight she hadn't fully understood until now, Eleanor slips from her chambers into the darkened corridor. Years of childhood exploration serve her well as she navigates the servants' passages, narrow hallways and back stairs, designed to keep the working aspects of the house invisible to noble residents and guests. The storm provides perfect cover for her escape, the thunder masking any sound of her movements and the household staff huddled in the warmth of the kitchen rather than patrolling the lesser-used areas of the manor. Heart pounding but steps determined, Eleanor finally reaches a small door used for bringing in firewood during winter months. She pushes it open and steps out into the storming night, the rain instantly soaking through her thin nightgown as she plunges into darkness, leaving behind everything she has ever known. Barefoot and drenched, Eleanor runs through the muddy estate grounds, each step sinking into the saturated earth as rain pounds mercilessly upon her slender form. Lightning slashes across the sky, momentarily illuminating her path before plunging her back into terrifying darkness. She stumbles repeatedly on the uneven ground, her feet numb from cold, palms scraped raw from falling on gravel and stone, yet she pushes forward toward the only sanctuary she can imagine, the blacksmith's cottage. The journey that had seemed so pleasant during her daytime visits now becomes a grueling ordeal as the deluge transforms gentle slopes into treacherous slides and familiar paths into nearly invisible trails. The thin fabric of her nightgown clings to her skin like a second layer, the modest garment rendered almost transparent by the downpour, her chestnut hair falling in sodden waves down her back as rain streams in rivulets down her face. Finally, the cottage appears before her, a solid shadow against the stormy night, a single light glowing from within suggesting Thomas remains awake despite the late hour. Eleanor practically falls against the wooden door, pounding with what little strength remains in her trembling limbs, each desperate knock containing the silent prayer that he will answer, that he will not turn away the madwoman she must appear to be. When the door swings open, Thomas stands frozen in momentary shock, the warm light from his cottage fire silhouetting his powerful frame as he takes in the sight before him, Lady Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of the Duke of Hawthorne and bride to a foreign prince, standing barefoot and desperate on his threshold, looking more like a drowned wraith than the composed noblewoman he had come to know. "I cannot marry him," she gasps, her voice barely audible above the thundering rain, her eyes wild with fear and determination. "I would rather be disowned than live a life without love or freedom." For the briefest moment, Thomas remains motionless, the enormity of what stands before him, of what she is asking without words, playing across his features as he weighs the consequences they both face should he offer the sanctuary she seeks. Then, as though some internal battle resolves itself, he reaches forward and gently pulls her inside, closing the door against the storm with one hand while wrapping a rough wool blanket around her shivering form with the other. His expression remains conflicted, concern for her immediate well-being warring with the grim knowledge that her presence here, in this state, and at this hour, has irrevocably altered both their fates. Dawn breaks with search parties scouring the estate grounds, their voices carrying faintly through the morning mist that has followed the night's deluge. Thomas and Eleanor sit by his dying fire, her borrowed clothes, a simple shirt and trousers rolled at the ankles, hanging loose on her slender frame. Their faces show the exhaustion of having talked through the night about possibilities and consequences, weighing options against increasingly dire realities. The fire cracks and shifts, sending a shower of embers into the stone hearth as Eleanor pulls the rough blanket tighter around her shoulders. "My father will never stop looking for me," she says hopelessly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the search parties might hear through the cottage's walls. The prince's pride will demand it. Even should they reach London, the Duke has connections throughout England, the prince diplomatic ties across Europe. There is nowhere within the civilized world that the daughter of a duke might hide without discovery. Thomas rises to add the last of his firewood to the dying flames, his movements deliberate as he arranges the logs with practiced efficiency. When he turns back to Eleanor, his expression is resolute, a decision reached during their long night of desperate planning. "Then we must go where they cannot follow," he suggests, returning to sit beside her on the simple wooden bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touch. "I have savings, skills useful anywhere. We could reach the port at Dover by tomorrow if we leave now. The implications of his words sink slowly into Eleanor's exhausted mind, the understanding that he is offering not merely temporary sanctuary, but to abandon his life here entirely for her sake. This cottage, his forge, the business he has built since returning from war, all sacrificed without hesitation for a woman he barely knows. "Why would you risk everything for me?" she asks, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or regret, finding only quiet determination in his steady gaze. His answer, when it comes, is simple, yet profound in its honesty. "Because in you, I see a courage that matches the fire of my forge." He takes her hands in his, their warmth enveloping her still cold fingers, his calloused palms a testament to years of honest labor. "When you first appeared at my door in the night, it wasn't a nobleman's daughter I saw, but a woman of extraordinary spirit willing to risk everything for her freedom. Such courage deserves to be honored with equal courage." The Duke arrives at the blacksmith's cottage with armed guards, just as Thomas and Eleanor frantically gather the few necessities for their escape. The small bag of provisions and Thomas' life savings sit on the rough wooden table between them when the door bursts open without warning, slamming against the interior wall with such force that dust shakes from the rafters. The Duke of Hawthorne fills the doorway, his imposing figure resplendent despite the early hour in riding clothes of the finest quality, his face a mask of cold fury as armed guards flank him on either side, hands resting meaningfully on the hilts of their swords. Behind them, visible through the open door, Prince Stephen sits astride a magnificent black stallion, observing the scene with the detached interest of a man watching an insect struggle in a spider's web. "Return to the manor immediately," the Duke commands his daughter, not bothering with pleasantries or explanations, his tone that of a man accustomed to instant obedience. Eleanor stands frozen for a moment, the borrowed clothing hanging loose on her frame, making her appear younger and more vulnerable than the composed noblewoman who had graced Blackwood Manor's ballroom just days before. Yet when she speaks, her voice carries a quiet strength previously untapped. "No, father, I cannot. I will not marry the prince." The simple declaration hangs in the air between them, each word a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled men. The Duke stares at his daughter as though seeing a stranger, his complexion darkening dangerously before he speaks again, each word precisely enunciated and cold with fury. "Then you are no longer my daughter. You will have nothing, no name, no dowry, no family. From this moment, you are dead to the house of Blackwood." The prince watches from horseback, rain beading on his immaculate cloak, his expression one of calculated disdain as he surveys the humble cottage with its forge and simple furnishings. "This display is beneath a woman who was to be my princess," he says dismissively, his accent more pronounced in his irritation. "You disgrace yourself with this common laborer when you were offered a crown." To everyone's shock, including perhaps her own, Eleanor straightens her spine and steps forward, her bare feet firmly planted on the earthen floor of the cottage, her chin lifted in defiance. "I would rather be a blacksmith's wife, with nothing but my freedom, than a princess with golden shackles," she replies, her voice carrying clearly to all present, the words hanging in the air like a challenge that cannot be withdrawn. Thomas moves swiftly to stand beside her, his powerful frame dwarfing Eleanor's slender form as he positions himself slightly ahead of her, a physical barrier between the woman he has come to love and the men who would claim her. Though he speaks no words, his presence alone challenges the Duke and Prince, the quiet dignity in his stance making clear that any attempt to remove Eleanor by force would meet with significant resistance. An unexpected intervention occurs when the Duchess suddenly arrives, the sound of hoofbeats announcing her presence moments before she appears in the clearing before the cottage. Unlike her husband, who demanded assistance to dismount, the Duchess swings gracefully from her saddle in a single fluid motion that speaks of a youth spent riding across country estates before marriage confined her to more proper activities. She approaches the tense standoff with measured steps, her riding habits splattered with mud from the hasty journey, her normally perfect coiffure coming loose beneath her hat. The armed guards part respectfully for her as she moves to stand between her husband and daughter, her back straight and her chin lifted in an echo of Eleanor's defiant pose. She speaks quietly, but firmly to the Duke, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness that has fallen over the scene. Once, I too was forced to choose duty over heart, she tells her husband, though her words are clearly meant for Eleanor's ears as well. I have regretted it every day since. The confession hangs in the air, heavy with decades of unspoken sorrow, a glimpse into a marriage that had been a business arrangement rather than a love match, explaining perhaps the distance that had always existed between the Duke and Duchess despite their 25 years together. She turns to face her daughter, tears glistening in eyes so like Eleanor's own, the resemblance between mother and daughter, suddenly striking in this moment of shared defiance. I will not watch my daughter make the same mistake, she declares, her voice gaining strength with each word. From beneath her cloak, she produces a small velvet pouch that clinks softly with its contents, placing it firmly in Eleanor's hand and closing her daughter's fingers around it. Eleanor feels the weight of the pouch, knowing without looking that it contains her mother's personal jewels, not the Blackwood family heirlooms but the few precious items that belonged to the Duchess alone, along with enough money to start a new life far from England. The Duke stares at his wife with stunned disbelief, decades of unquestioning obedience shattered in a single act of rebellion. His voice when he finally speaks is cold with betrayal. Then you choose her over your duty as well, he says, the accusation falling between them like a physical barrier. The Duchess does not flinch or look away, meeting her husband's gaze with quiet certainty as she delivers her response. I choose love, at last, she says simply, the words both a declaration of support for her daughter and a quiet indictment of her own life choices. Thomas and Eleanor escape in the ensuing confusion, slipping away as the Duke and Duchess engage in their first genuine confrontation after decades of silent resignation. Thomas had prepared his workman's cart at first light, a simple conveyance typically used for transporting metal and supplies, now hastily loaded with essential provisions. While the nobles argue in raised voices that carry across the clearing, Thomas helps Eleanor into the cart, concealing her beneath a canvas tarp as he calmly leads his sturdy draft horse along a seldom-used path that skirts the edge of Blackwood property. Their journey begins in tense silence, both acutely aware that pursuit could materialize at any moment should the Duke overcome his shock and dispatch riders along the main roads toward London. Instead of following predictable routes, Thomas guides them cross-country, using the knowledge of local terrain gained during his blacksmithing travels to navigate forgotten paths through woods and farmers' fields. The journey proves fraught with danger and discomfort, sleeping in abandoned barns when they can find them, or beneath hedgerows when no shelter presents itself. They avoid villages and posting houses where news and descriptions would surely have preceded them, instead seeking aid from isolated farmers and cottagers who have little connection to aristocratic concerns. Eleanor, who had never before prepared her own meals or slept on straw, discovers reserves of resilience she never knew she possessed, learning to build fires, forage for edible plants, and mend tears in her borrowed clothing. With each passing day and each obstacle overcome, the bond between them deepens, formal titles and class distinctions dissolving in the face of shared hardship and growing affection. Thomas uses the last of his carefully saved coins to secure passage on a merchant vessel bound for America, bribing the captain to ask no questions about the unmarried couple seeking transport to the New World. They will sail on the morning tide, leaving behind not just England, but the entire social structure that would forever keep them apart. On their final night before reaching Dover, they shelter in an abandoned shepherd's cottage, its roof partially collapsed, but still offering protection from the evening chill. Seated before a small fire built from broken fence posts, Thomas finally gives voice to feelings that have grown impossible to contain. I have loved you since you first appeared at my forge, curious and unafraid, he confesses, his strong hands suddenly uncertain as they reach for hers across the narrow space between them. The woman who sought freedom rather than position, who saw value in honest work rather than empty titles. Eleanor moves toward him in the flickering firelight, her response requiring no words as she closes the distance between them. Their first kiss tastes of freedom and possibility, her soft lips meeting his with equal passion and certainty, sealing a connection formed in the crucible of their shared defiance. On the ship to America, Eleanor stands at the rail watching England disappear behind them, the white cliffs of Dover gradually fading into the misty horizon. The sea stretches endlessly before them, a vast expanse of possibility and uncertainty that mirrors the future they have chosen. The salt spray mingles with the wind to tangle her hair, no longer perfectly arranged by servants but falling loose around her shoulders. Her borrowed dress, simple and practical, flutters against her legs as the ship cuts through the waves, carrying her toward a life she could never have imagined just weeks earlier. Thomas joins her at the rail, his solid presence, a comfort as he places his calloused hand over hers, where it rests on the weathered wood. "Do you regret it?" he asks quietly, his voice nearly lost in the cry of seabirds and snapping of canvas sails overhead, leaving everything behind. The question hangs between them, honest and necessary. Eleanor considers all she has abandoned, the title that had defined her existence since birth, the luxury she had taken for granted, the security of a predetermined path, the mother who finally revealed her true heart only to be left behind. The wind carries the last visible trace of England away as she turns to face the man who had risked everything for her freedom. "I regret only the years I spent trying to be what others demanded," she answers, finding truth in the words as they form on her lips. "With you, I am finally myself." The simple declaration contains more honesty than all the formal promises she would have made at the altar with Prince Stephen, the weight of pretense finally lifted from her shoulders as completely as England has disappeared from view. That night, in the privacy of their small cabin, with the rhythmic creaking of the ship and the gentle rocking of the waves as their only witnesses, they consummate their love. The narrow berth becomes a sacred space where titles and stations cease to matter, where only their shared humanity exists. Eleanor discovers a passion and tenderness she never knew possible, her body awakening to sensations that would have remained forever dormant in the cold, dutiful union with the prince. Thomas touches her with reverence and desire in equal measure, his strength tempered by gentleness as they learn each other in the most intimate way. Their union, though not yet formalized by law or church, is sealed in their hearts, a private covenant more binding than any arranged marriage could ever be. 1 year later in Boston, Thomas has established a successful blacksmith shop in a bustling corner of the growing city, the steady ring of his hammer drawing admiring crowds who watch through the open doors as he transforms raw metal into objects of both beauty and function. His status as a war veteran, combined with his exceptional skill, has earned him respect among the practical New Englanders who value craftsmanship and honest labor above accidents of birth. The simple sign reading Clark Blacksmithing has become known throughout Boston for quality work delivered on time, with a waiting list of customers seeking everything from ornamental railings for newly built townhouses to specialized tools for the shipbuilding industry that drives the city's economy. Eleanor, now known simply as Mrs. Clark, has discovered talents that would have remained forever dormant had she fulfilled her prescribed role as a princess of Verbania. Drawing on her lifelong interest in botany, once dismissed by her father as a frivolous pastime for a duke's daughter, she now creates herbal remedies that she sells at the local market twice weekly. Her knowledge of plants, combined with healing techniques learned from both an elderly neighbor and a Wampanoag woman who visits the market, has earned her a growing reputation as a skilled herbalist whose tinctures and salves often succeed where conventional treatments fail. Their modest home above the forge bears no resemblance to the grand chambers of Blackwood Manor, with its simple furnishings built by Thomas in his spare hours and cheerful curtains sewn by Eleanor from fabric purchased with her own earnings. Yet the small rooms are filled with more warmth and genuine happiness than she ever experienced in her father's mansion, the love between them transforming the humble space into something no palace could match. On a crisp autumn morning, as Eleanor arranges dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and Thomas works below, a letter arrives bearing an English postmark, the elegant handwriting immediately recognizable as her mother's. With trembling fingers, Eleanor breaks the seal to discover pages filled with extraordinary news. The Duchess writes that she has finally found the courage to leave the Duke, establishing her own household in a modest but comfortable property that formed part of her original dowry. Though society whispers behind gloved hands about the scandal, she describes a sense of freedom that echoes Eleanor's own journey. The letter concludes with news that brings tears to Eleanor's eyes. Her mother plans to visit them in the spring, having already booked passage on a merchant vessel similar to the one that carried her daughter to freedom. The Duchess arrives in Boston on a fine spring morning, stepping tentatively onto American soil with wide eyes that take in the bustling harbour city so unlike the refined streets of London. Thomas closes his shop for the day, and together he and Eleanor wait at the docks, scanning each disembarking passenger until finally they spot her, elegant even after weeks at sea. The reunion unfolds in a flurry of tearful embraces, the Duchess gasping in surprise as she fully beholds her daughter transformed. Eleanor stands before her mother radiantly different from the dutiful young woman who once moved silently through Blackwood Manor. Her chestnut hair is simply arranged, her dress practical but becoming, and most striking is the confidence that straightens her spine and brightens her eyes. Most astonishing to the Duchess is the unmistakable curve of Eleanor's belly beneath her apron, the promise of a grandchild she had feared she would never know. They walk arm in arm through the streets of Boston, the Duchess marveling at the democratic bustle of the American city, where merchants and laborers move with the same purpose and dignity as the occasional gentleman in fine clothes. In the modest apartment above the forge, they exchange stories late into the night, each woman finding healing in the sharing. Eleanor speaks of their difficult journey, of building a new life from nothing but skill and determination, while the Duchess recounts her own awakening courage in establishing independence after 25 years of silent submission. "Your father still refuses to speak your name," the Duchess tells Eleanor as they sit in the small but cheerful kitchen. Thomas preparing tea with the ease of a man accustomed to domestic partnership rather than rigid separation of duties. "But I bring news nonetheless. The prince married a German princess 3 months after your departure. They appear utterly miserable together." She describes the rushed alliance, arranged with even less pretense of affection than Eleanor's would have been. The German princess reportedly kept under even stricter supervision than Eleanor had faced. The political advantage gained apparently worth the evident mutual distaste between the royal couple. Eleanor laughs, a free and genuine sound as she places a hand on her growing belly, feeling the strong movements of the child within. "While I, disowned and disgraceful, have found more riches than his kingdom could ever provide," she responds, exchanging a look of pure contentment with Thomas as he sets the simple earthenware cups before them. The Duchess observes this silent communication between her daughter and son-in-law, witnessing the profound connection she herself had never experienced, and finds that the last remnants of regret for Eleanor's choice dissolve completely in the warmth of this humble home filled with authentic happiness. 5 years later, the modest cabin Thomas and Eleanor first called home has expanded into a prosperous homestead on the outskirts of Boston. The original structure now forms just one wing of their dwelling, with new rooms added as their family and fortunes grew in tandem. The forge that once occupied most of their living space has been relocated to a separate building where Thomas employs 2 apprentices, his reputation for exceptional craftsmanship spreading far beyond the city limits to attract commissions from wealthy patrons up and down the eastern seaboard. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across their property as Thomas and Eleanor stand in the doorway, watching their 2 children play in the garden. 4-year-old James chases butterflies with the single-minded determination inherited from his father, while little Margaret, not yet 2, toddles after her brother with delighted squeals. The vegetable garden beyond yields abundant produce, interspersed with carefully tended herbs that serve both culinary and medicinal purposes. Eleanor has become a respected herbalist, whose remedies are sought throughout the region. Her knowledge of plants, combined with an intuitive understanding of human ailments, creating treatments often more effective than those prescribed by formally trained physicians. Her small apothecary shop adjoining their home draws visitors from considerable distances, many willing to travel days to consult the English herbalist whose gentle remedies have succeeded where conventional treatments failed. Eleanor leans against her husband's solid frame as they observe their children, his arms circling her waist with the easy familiarity of profound intimacy. "Do you ever miss being your Grace?" Thomas asks teasingly, though a hint of genuine curiosity colors the question. After all, she had been raised to become a duchess, prepared since birth for a life of aristocratic privilege and power, only to end up in a country that recognizes no titles and where hard work rather than lineage determines one's place in society. Eleanor turns in his arms to face him, her expression alight with contentment as she studies the face that has become as familiar and essential to her as her own heartbeat. "I found more grace in one night of running barefoot to your cottage than in 20 years of curtsying in ballrooms," she replies with absolute conviction, rising on tiptoes to place a gentle kiss on his lips. The setting sun bathes them in golden light as their children race toward them, eager for the evening meal and bedtime stories that form the simple rhythms of their family life. Eleanor gathers Margaret into her arms while Thomas swings James onto his shoulders, the four of them framed in the doorway of the home they have built together through determination and love. As they move inside, Eleanor reflects that in losing everything that once defined her, title, wealth, family name, she gained the only thing that truly mattered, a life authentically and fearlessly lived, with a love forged as strong as the steel from Thomas's anvil.